For over a century, domestic servants outnumbered the families they served by 3 to 1. By 1900, over 2 million people worked in service in Britain alone. They were the invisible backbone of empire. They raised the children they could never call their own. They kept secrets that could destroy families. They worked themselves to early graves so their employers could enjoy leisure. And almost nobody remembers their names. Over the next few hours, we'll uncover the real Downton Abbey, the hierarchy that was more rigid than any military structure. The rules that governed every moment of their lives. The forbidden loves. The struggles. The extraordinary ways they found to survive and reclaim their humanity. This is not the story Hollywood told you. This is the story the servants themselves left behind in letters, diaries, and oral histories, and it's far stranger and far deeper than fiction. As you listen, let the story unfold at its own pace. There's no rush. You're here to rest and to listen, and that's exactly what you'll do. To understand the world of domestic service, you first need to understand the mathematics of power. In a typical large country house during the Edwardian era, there might be 12 to 16 family members. But below stairs, 40 to 60 servants. Yet those 12 family members received almost all the attention. They had names, they had history. They had agency. The 60 people who made their lives possible, they were interchangeable parts. A servant's contract often began at age 12 or 13. Usually they came from poor families in villages or industrial cities. The promise was simple: room and board, a small wage, and the opportunity to better yourself through service. The reality was starkly different. Margaret Powell was a cook who later became a radio personality and author. In her memoirs, she described her first position at age 14. I was given a uniform that was too big, shoes that didn't fit, and a list of 47 rules I wasn't allowed to break. I was told I would be happy there. What I found was that happiness wasn't part of the job description. The houses themselves were designed as two separate worlds. The family lived in the staterooms, the parlors, the galleries, spaces filled with light, art, and beauty. The servants had the basements, the attics, the narrow corridors. Often, the servants' quarters were deliberately hidden from family view by doors and corridors designed to be invisible. The famous architect Robert Adam deliberately designed houses where servants could move through the building without ever being seen by the family. This wasn't just about privacy for the wealthy, it was about maintaining the fiction that the comfortable life simply happened, that tables set themselves, that dirt somehow didn't exist. One servant described it as living in the walls. The house in the TV series Downton Abbey is based on Highclere Castle, and like many such estates, it contains miles of servant passages, narrow, cold, with ceilings so low that tall servants would have to duck. These passages connected the visible world of luxury to the hidden world of labor. And this hidden world had its own strict rules. If there was one rule above all others in a grand household, it was this: know your place and never attempt to rise above it. The hierarchy below stairs was as complex and rigid as anything in the British Army. But unlike the Army, there was almost no way to rise through the ranks. Your position was determined by your age, your gender, and your family connections, usually before you arrived. At the very top of the servant hierarchy was the housekeeper, almost always a woman. She was the closest thing servants had to real power. She hired and fired. She made decisions about spending. She disciplined other servants. But here's the crucial thing. Even the housekeeper answered to the butler, the head of male servants. And the butler answered to the master of the house. The butler was often the most powerful person a servant would ever meet. He represented the authority of the family without being subject to their whims in the same way. As one servant memoir described it, the butler was like a god. He could dismiss you, and your life was over. Below the butler came the footmen and the male servants, ranked by height, age, and skill. Below the housekeeper came the ladies, maids, housemaids, kitchen maids, laundry maids, and at the absolute bottom, the scullery maid. The scullery maid was the lowest of the low point 3. She had no time off, no privacy, and no protection. She would spend 12 to 16 hours a day in a hot, wet, steam-filled kitchen. Her hands perpetually burned and blistered from the lye soap used to clean pots and pans. She would eat the scraps of food, sleep in the coldest corner of the servants' quarters, and have the least likelihood of ever improving her position. The mortality rate among scullery maids was shockingly high, not from disease alone, but from the conditions: burns, infections, malnutrition, and the psychological weight of being at the absolute bottom of the human hierarchy. One scullery maid, writing anonymously in a Victorian publication, described her first day. "I was shown the scullery and told that would be my kingdom. It was not a kingdom. It was a sentence." But the hierarchy wasn't just about rank. It was about an almost totalitarian control of behavior. Take the matter of speech. A servant was not supposed to speak unless spoken to. This wasn't a suggestion. It was written into employment contracts. Many servants went through entire days with almost no human conversation, even though they were surrounded by people. A lady's maid might spend 8 hours alone with her mistress, helping her dress, preparing her bath, arranging her hair, all in silence. If the maid spoke, even to ask a necessary question, it could be recorded as impertinence and noted in her reference, which would follow her to every job for the rest of her life. A bad reference could literally end a servant's career. A servant who was dismissed without a reference might as well have left the country. No respectable house would hire them. And without a position, they faced poverty, workhouses, or worse. This wasn't accidental. This was intentional architecture of control. The servants weren't just employees. They were living extensions of their employer's will. As one guide for ladies' maids put it, your thoughts, your feelings, your physical needs are subordinate to those of your mistress. You are not a separate person. You are an instrument of her comfort and status. And the punishment for forgetting this was swift and absolute. Let's walk through an actual day in the life of a servant in an Edwardian country house, not the romanticized version, the real one. It's 5:30 a.m. A bell rings. Actually, multiple bells ring in the servants' quarters. each one indicating a different room in the house that needs attention. It's still dark outside. The temperature in the attic bedrooms where many servants slept was often below freezing in winter. A housemaid gets up in the dark, washes in cold water from a pitcher, and puts on her uniform. The morning uniform was different from the afternoon uniform, which was different from the evening uniform. Servants needed multiple sets of clothes, and these came from their meager wages. By 5:45, she's downstairs. The first task: cleaning the fireplaces and grates. This meant crawling into fireplaces covered in soot and ash, using special tools and brushes to scrub every surface. A servant could spend 2 hours on the fireplaces in just one hallway. The soot could cause respiratory disease. Many servants developed chronic coughs that lasted their entire lives. Chimney lung, or servant's cough, was so common that it was hardly remarked upon. People just expected servants to cough. By 7 a.m., the fires are lit and the house is beginning to wake. Now the housemaid needs to empty the chamber pots from every bedroom. These weren't flushing toilets, they were pots under beds. She would empty them, clean them with cold water and vinegar, and return them. All before the family members in those rooms had even woken up. By 8 a.m., she might get a cup of tea and a piece of bread. This wasn't given as kindness, this was fuel for the day ahead, the equivalent of giving a machine oil. From 8 o'clock to noon, she might sweep and dust the public rooms, beat carpets, polish furniture, clean mirrors, and dozens of other tasks that had to be completed before the family began using these rooms. Beating a carpet could take hours and was done by hand, creating clouds of dust that servants breathed in without protection. At noon, if she was lucky, she might get 30 minutes to eat, usually a meal of bread, cheese, cold meat, and weak tea. She would not sit at the family table. Servants ate in the servants' hall, and even there, hierarchy determined where you sat. The upper servants, the butler, the housekeeper, the cook, sat at one end. From 1 o'clock to 5 p.m., more cleaning, more tasks. The afternoon work varied, perhaps helping with laundry, perhaps preparing rooms, perhaps helping other servants with their work. At 5 o'clock or 6 p.m., there might be an hour of free time. But this time wasn't actually free. It was the time for servants to mend their clothes, polish their shoes, prepare their uniforms for the next day. An hour was barely enough time to do the basic maintenance on a life. At 6 p.m., there was evening work. If the family was dining at home, servants would be needed to help serve dinner, clear tables, wash dishes. A formal dinner service for a family of 12 could generate hours of work for the kitchen staff and the servants who served the food. A footman serving dinner would need to stand at attention for 2 to 3 hours, moving food plates, refilling glasses, standing motionless when not actively serving. A single movement out of place, a wrong expression, a moment of fatigue showing on the face, any of these could be noted and held against him. If the family had guests, the work extended even later. After dinner was cleared, the servants would need to clean the dining room, wash all the dishes and glassware, return everything to its proper place. This could take until 10 o'clock or 11 p.m. But before 11 p.m., the servants would gather for prayers. This was mandatory. Even if you'd been working for 16 hours, You stood in the servants' hall while the housekeeper or butler read from the Bible and led a brief service. Spiritual discipline was part of the job. By midnight, a servant might finally be allowed to go to bed. In the morning, the bell would ring at 5:30 a.m. again. This wasn't an occasional day. This was every day, 6 days a week. Sunday was theoretically a day off, but servants still had to prepare Sunday meals, maintain the house, and often attend church services as representatives of their employers' piety. A servant worked approximately 80 to 100 hours per week, for which they earned between £8 and £20 per year. That's roughly equivalent to £15,000 to £40,000 in modern currency, but adjusted for working hours, it was among the lowest paid work available. And this was only the routine work. If there was a large gathering, a party, a significant guest, the hours extended even further. Some servants recorded working 30, sometimes 40 hours without sleep during major events. One servant's diary, discovered in the archives of the Victoria and Albert Museum, contains an entry from the time of a major house party. June 14th, rose at 5 o'clock, worked until 2 a.m. June 15th, rose at 5 o'clock, worked until 3 a.m. June 16th, rose at 5 o'clock, worked until 4 a.m. June 17th, day off in theory, but worked the morning preparing rooms. Rose at 5 o'clock, worked until 10 p.m. I do not remember what sleep feels like. This diary entry, made in a careful hand, shows signs of deteriorating handwriting as the days progress. By June 17th, the letters are shaky, almost illegible. The physical exhaustion is visible in the handwriting itself. Every large house operated according to a written or unwritten code of rules. Some of these rules were formal, written down, distributed to new servants, enforced through contracts. Others were informal, but no less binding. Here are some actual rules from period household management books and accounts. Silence is service. A servant should not speak unless spoken to. A servant should not initiate conversation. Even necessary information should be conveyed in as few words as possible. One handbook stated, "A servant should be present but invisible, useful but unremarked." Naib discretion is duty. Whatever you see or hear in this house is not your concern and is never to be discussed. Not with family members, not with other servants, not with anyone outside the house. A servant who gossiped about family affairs was dismissed immediately and given a bad reference. One servant who wrote about her experience described catching a family member in a compromising situation with a guest. She said nothing, did nothing, and continued her work as if nothing had happened. But because she had seen something, she knew that the family could never fully trust her again. She left the position voluntarily rather than live under that suspicion. Propriety is paramount. This rule was especially strict for female servants. You could not laugh too loudly. You could not engage in flirtation with male servants, which included almost any conversation not directly work-related. You could not wear anything that drew attention to your body. You could not go out unaccompanied. You could not receive letters from men. You could not, under any circumstances, have a romantic relationship. A female servant who became pregnant for any reason was immediately dismissed. There were no exceptions. Not because she had done anything wrong by modern standards, but because her presence would corrupt the other servants and sully the reputation of the house. Obedience is obligation. You will do exactly as instructed, without question, without hesitation, without discussion. The command of your superior is law. But here's where it gets more complicated. Superior could mean different things. A lady's maid had to obey not just the housekeeper and the butler, but also her specific mistress. If the mistress's instructions contradicted those of the housekeeper, what was the servant supposed to do? These contradictions became a form of control. A servant could be punished for following the wrong person's orders, and she could never know in advance which orders took precedence. Respectability is requirement. Your behavior outside the house reflects on the reputation of the family. You must attend church regularly. You must not be seen in public houses or with disreputable people. Your free time is never truly free because you are always representing the family. Personal life is prohibited. Servants often couldn't see family members except on their one day off per month. They couldn't date. They couldn't marry without permission, and often couldn't marry at all. Some employers had explicit rules against married servants. They couldn't have hobbies that consumed time or energy. They couldn't read for pleasure. Reading was seen as putting ideas above one's station. They couldn't write letters without oversight. One lady's maid described her life. I wasn't a person. I was equipment. The difference between me and the furniture I dusted was that the furniture didn't need to eat. But perhaps the most totalitarian rule was this: you are always visible. In a house where privacy was restricted, where rooms had connecting doors and hidden passages, where the walls had ears, a servant was never truly alone. You could be observed at any time. Your work could be inspected. Your behavior could be commented on. Your emotional state was not your own. You had to maintain the appropriate affect at all times. Many servants developed an almost schizophrenic existence. They had an external self, calm, compliant, efficient, respectful, and an internal self that they could never show anyone. In their diaries and personal accounts, they reveal thoughts of rage, frustration, despair, and longing, but these thoughts could never be expressed in the house. One servant kept a diary that was written in a complex code, apparently out of fear that it might be discovered and read. The fact that she felt the need to encode her private thoughts speaks volumes about the invasion of privacy these people endured. And the system was designed so that these rules would be internalized. Servants weren't just forced to obey, they were made to feel that they should obey, that this hierarchy was natural and right, that their subjugation was for their own good. The church was complicit in this. Servants were regularly told that their position was divinely ordained. In the Bible, they were told, servants were instructed to obey their masters. Their acceptance of their fate was morally superior to rebellion. One vicar's sermon to servants, recorded in the archives, said, "You are fortunate to serve in a great house. Your station in life is ordained by God. To rebel against your station is to rebel against God Himself. Accept your position with grace, and you will be rewarded in heaven." What happened, of course, was that servants learned to accept their position with grace while seething internally. And this internal pressure had to be released somehow. It came out in gossip, in spite, in small acts of defiance, in the creation of their own culture below stairs that the family above knew nothing about. Servants were human beings, which meant they had emotions, desires, and dreams, all of which were supposed to be subordinated to their work. The most strictly forbidden aspect of a servant's life was romantic love. For female servants, the rules were absolute. No courting, no flirtation, no romantic entanglements of any kind. A female servant who became engaged had to leave her position before marriage. A female servant who was suspected of impropriety was dismissed immediately. And the definition of impropriety was shockingly broad. Being alone with a male servant could be considered improper. Having conversations that lasted longer than necessary could be improper. Accepting any kind of personal gift could be improper. Having a pen pal could be improper. One female servant was dismissed because she was found writing a letter to her brother. The letter mentioned a boy she knew before she went into service. She wasn't courting him, but the mere fact that she had written about him was considered inappropriate. Yet the household itself was a hothouse of romantic and sexual tension. Servants worked in close proximity. They were young, mostly, and physically attractive, because servants were often hired partly for their appearance. They spent hours together, shared secrets, depended on each other for survival and sanity. In these conditions, romantic attachments formed almost inevitably. And when they did, they had to be completely hidden. The most common romantic relationships were between servants of different ranks. A footman might fall in love with a housemaid. A kitchen maid might develop feelings for a young footman. These relationships had to be conducted in complete secrecy. One account describes a kitchen maid and a footman who communicated entirely through the placement of objects. A particular cup in a particular location meant, "Meet me at the garden wall at 8. A flower tucked into the corner of a room meant, "Not tonight, too much supervision." They developed an entire language of objects because they couldn't speak to each other openly. When they could steal moments alone, they had to be brief, 5 minutes perhaps, in a storage room or a corner of the garden. The fear of discovery was constant. If they were caught, both would be dismissed immediately, without references. But there was another category of forbidden relationship that was perhaps even more fraught. The relationship between a servant and someone above them. Many female servants were sexually assaulted by employers, family members, and male guests. This was an open secret that almost no one discussed publicly. A female servant in such a situation had essentially no recourse. She couldn't report the assault because she would be blamed. She couldn't leave because she would be fired without a reference. And often, if she became pregnant, she would be blamed entirely for the situation, portrayed as having seduced the man. The memoir of Rose Dutton, a lady's maid who later became a journalist, contains a devastating account of being assaulted by her employer's son and then being dismissed without a reference because she, quote, made accusations against a gentleman. She wrote, "I was 21 years old. He was 23. He came to my room at night and did what he wanted. I could not stop him. I could not call for help. The next morning when I reported it to the housekeeper, I was called a liar and worse." I was dismissed by noon. My life was over, and no one would ever believe me. The power imbalance made any kind of relationship impossible. A female servant could not truly consent to a relationship with an employer or family member, because refusing him meant immediate dismissal and ruin. And yet the legal and social system treated her as having seduced him, as having been the aggressor. Some female servants became pregnant through assault. Many of these women were sent away to homes for unwed mothers, where they would give birth in secrecy and the child would be taken away. Some were forced to give up their children to workhouses or to adoption by wealthy families. The psychological trauma was immense, and there was no therapy, no acknowledgement, no justice. One of the most touching historical accounts involves a footman and a housemaid who had been secretly courting for 3 years. They couldn't marry without leaving service because the household didn't allow married servants. They couldn't continue in service because their relationship, if discovered, would result in dismissal. So they made a choice. They both saved every penny they could. They began planning a future outside of service. Finally, in 1908, they left their positions on the same day, married quietly, and started a new life. He became a tradesman. She took in laundry work. By all accounts, they were happy. But they had to give up their entire professional identity to have a personal life. The system allowed no room for them to have both. For male servants, the situation was somewhat different, but no less constrained. Male servants were often expected to remain unmarried because married men had families and divided loyalties. A butler who was married might be seen as less devoted to the house. Male servants who had relationships outside of their official role were dismissed, though perhaps with less social condemnation than female servants. And then there were the relationships that crossed even greater boundaries. The Victorian and Edwardian era is remembered as prudish, but homosexuality, while illegal and deeply hidden, did exist. Some of these relationships formed between servants. A few rare historical accounts mention romantic relationships between male servants or between female servants. These had to be hidden with even greater care, because they would have resulted not just in dismissal, but potentially in legal prosecution. But what's remarkable is that despite the absolute prohibition, despite the constant surveillance, despite the catastrophic consequences for discovery, romantic relationships formed anyway. Servants, being human, insisted on their own humanity. They found ways to love, to connect, to maintain some sense of personal life, despite a system designed to deny it to them. In doing so, they committed what the system saw as an act of rebellion. They refused to be only what their employers needed them to be. They maintained an interior life. They had dreams, desires, and feelings. And the system punished them harshly for it. The romantic image of Downton Abbey obscures a darker reality. Domestic service was one of the most exploitative forms of labor in modern history. Let's start with the basics. Wages. A senior servant in 1900 might earn £20 per year. In modern terms, this sounds reasonable, perhaps equivalent to £40,000. But here's the critical difference. Servants had almost no expenses, so they could save nothing. They were provided with room and board, but the room was a tiny attic bedroom shared with one or more other servants. The board was basic: bread, cheese, thin soups, meat scraps. No meals were wasted on servants. food was calculated to provide exactly enough calories to keep them working, no more. The uniform was provided, but the servant had to pay for replacements and repairs. Footmen had to pay for the polish that kept their buttons and shoes bright. These costs came from their meager wages. Medical care was not provided. If a servant was injured or ill, they paid for their own care or did without. Many servants worked while injured or ill because they couldn't afford to be sick. A housemaid with a fever was expected to continue working. A footman with a severe cut on his hand was expected to continue serving dinner. A kitchen maid with a burn severe enough to blister was expected to continue working in the hot kitchen. The concept of workers' compensation did not exist. If you were injured on the job, you bore the cost of your injury. If you became too ill or injured to work, you lost your position and your reference. One servant's account describes a kitchen maid who suffered a severe burn on her arm when hot liquid splashed. The burn became infected. The infection became so severe that the arm required amputation. She was sent to a hospital, but the household did not pay for her care. When she was released, she was dismissed without a reference because she could no longer work. She was left destitute. But the exploitation wasn't just financial. Physical abuse was common and often went unpunished. An employer could strike a servant with relative impunity. A lady might slap her maid's face if she was displeased. A master might strike a footman if he made a mistake. These actions were not considered assault. They were considered discipline. From the perspective of the wealthy, servants were children who needed correction. A master striking his servant was exercising appropriate authority, not committing violence. One memoir by a former servant, published anonymously, contains this account. When I made a mistake in how I pressed the gown, I was struck across the face so hard that my teeth cut into my lip. I was told that I was clumsy, and that this was what happened to clumsy servants. I said nothing, did nothing. I simply took the blood that was filling my mouth and continued working. Violence was often psychological as well. Servants were regularly humiliated in front of other servants. A footman might be publicly criticized for a minor mistake. A maid might be dressed down in front of her peers. This public humiliation was a tool of control. It reinforced the hierarchy and discouraged any sense of fellowship among the servants. Theft was another form of control. If a servant was suspected of stealing, or if something went missing, the entire household might be searched. Some households required servants to change clothes entirely after finishing each shift, standing in front of others, because it was feared that they might steal small items. The invasiveness of this was profound. A woman having to strip and change in front of others, with the implicit accusation that she was a thief, normalized the violation of her body and her dignity. But one of the most insidious forms of exploitation was moral and emotional. Servants were constantly told that they were morally inferior. They were told that they should be grateful for their positions. They were told that their lives were meant to be lives of service, that this was their proper station, that anything beyond this was selfish and sinful. This created a profound sense of shame and unworthiness that affected many servants throughout their lives. A woman who was a servant at age 14 and later became a writer described the emotional toll. I was made to feel that there was something wrong with me, that I was born to serve, that any desire to be more than a servant was immoral. I internalized this so completely that even when I became successful, I felt like a fraud. It took me decades to understand that I wasn't born to serve anyone. There was also the exploitation of sexuality. As discussed in the previous chapter, many female servants were sexually assaulted by employers and family members. But even beyond outright assault, there was a constant pressure to be sexually available, to accept unwanted touching, to maintain a certain appearance designed to be attractive. Female servants were often hired, at least in part, for their appearance. A young, pretty maid was preferred to an older, plainer one. This wasn't coincidence. It was a reflection of the fact that female servants were seen as existing partly for the aesthetic and sexual pleasure of the household. Female servants developed survival strategies around their sexuality. Some became very modest and plain in appearance, trying to be invisible. Others used what little power they had to navigate the dangerous terrain of being a young, attractive woman in a position of absolute vulnerability. The trauma of this situation is hard to overstate. A young woman in service was told that her body was not her own, that it existed to serve others, that she had no right to set boundaries, and that any violation was somehow her fault. And the system made it impossible to escape. If you left service, where would you go? No job paid, as well as service. Your options were domestic work, factory work, or sex work. Service was the least terrible option, even when it was terrible. One serving woman described it as being trapped. We were not free. We were not paid fairly. We were not protected. We had no rights. So we stayed, and we endured. The long-term health effects of service were significant. Servants died younger than other workers. They had higher rates of chronic disease. They had higher rates of disability. Many former servants who left service in their 30s and 40s had bodies that looked 60. By 1900, there were beginning to be reformers who spoke out against the exploitation of servants. But these were minority voices. The system was seen as natural, necessary, and divinely ordained. And the servants themselves, at least publicly, accepted it. They had internalized the message that this was their place, their duty, their obligation. It would take a world war, a dramatic shift in social consciousness, and the gradual elimination of domestic service to fundamentally challenge this system. And even then, the hierarchy and exploitation persisted in changed forms. The real Downton Abbey wasn't just a drama of class differences. It was a system of exploitation, maintained through psychological conditioning, physical force, and the removal of all alternatives. If there was a kingdom within the household, it was the kitchen. The kitchen was the domain of the cook, and the cook was the closest thing servants had to an independent power. A good cook was valuable. Valuable enough that some cooks could actually negotiate their terms of employment. A cook could demand higher wages, better quarters, and more control over her domain. But this power came with enormous responsibility and came at great cost. A large house's kitchen staff might include a head cook, one or more assistant cooks, several kitchen maids, and a scullery maid or two. The hierarchy was strict. The head cook's word was law. An assistant cook who overstepped would be dismissed. A kitchen maid who made a mistake would face the cook's wrath. And the cook's wrath was feared. Historical accounts describe cooks who threw things, who screamed, who physically struck kitchen workers. The environment of the kitchen, the heat, the pressure, the complexity of feeding a large household, created a cauldron of stress that was often taken out on the workers below. One kitchen maid described her experience. The cook was like a tyrant. If the soup was not hot enough when served, she would make us remake it. If a pot was dirty when we returned it, she would have us scrub it again. She would yell and throw things, and we would jump. My hands shook constantly from fear. The kitchen was one of the most dangerous places in the house. A kitchen maid's hands were often in hot water, reaching into pots of boiling liquid, grabbing hot pans. Burns were constant. Many kitchen workers had hands covered in scars from old burns. Some burns became infected and led to loss of fingers or limbs. The kitchen itself was unsanitary by modern standards. Food waste accumulated, insects were common, sanitation was poor. Diseases spread through the kitchen staff. A scullery maid, who had to drink the same water she used to clean pots and pans, was particularly vulnerable to intestinal parasites and diseases. Many scullery maids developed chronic diarrhea that lasted for years. It was so common that it was barely remarked upon. People just assumed scullery maids would have constant stomach problems. The work was also incredibly monotonous. A scullery maid's entire job, every single day, was to wash pots and pans. That was it. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year. The same motion, repeated tens of thousands of times. This led to what we might now recognize as repetitive strain injury, but which was then just seen as normal weakness. A woman who worked as a scullery maid from age 12 to 18 described her hands. When I left service, I could barely use my hands. My fingers were permanently bent. The cook said that was normal, that I would have to get used to it. I left service because my hands could no longer do the work, and I was dismissed without a reference. The food that servants ate was dramatically different from the food they prepared. A typical dinner for the family might include multiple courses, fresh meat, vegetables, elegant sauces. The food was carefully prepared, beautifully presented, and made with the finest ingredients. Meanwhile, the servants were eating cold meat, bread, and thin soup, often made from the scraps left over from the family meals. One servant described the bitter irony. I spent 8 hours a day preparing the most beautiful food. And then I ate the scraps. I had to watch the family eat a perfect roasted pheasant, and then I ate the bones boiled in water. But the real damage was done to the cooks themselves. A head cook in a large household was responsible for feeding dozens of people. She had to know how to prepare dozens of different dishes. She had to manage a budget. She had to oversee staff. She had to create meals day after day, year after year. And she was under constant pressure. If the family wasn't satisfied with a meal, the cook was blamed. If the cost of food exceeded the budget, the cook was blamed. If a guest complained about the food, the cook was blamed. But if the food was excellent, the credit went to the family for having excellent taste in hiring a good cook. Many cooks worked until late into their lives. Retirement wasn't a thing for servants. A cook worked until she could no longer work, and then she was cast off with a meager pension if she was fortunate. The physical toll was immense. Varicose veins from standing all day. Arthritis in the hands and arms from years of repetitive work. respiratory problems from the heat and fumes of the kitchen, hearing loss from the constant noise. By the time a cook was 50, she often had the body of someone much older. Yet cooks were often the most respected servants in the household. They had achieved a position of power through their skills. They were crucial to the family's ability to maintain their status. And some cooks took pride in this role. There are historical accounts of cooks who saw their work as art, who were genuinely proud of the meals they created, who found meaning in the work despite the exploitation. A letter from one cook, written late in her life, described her pride. "I made beautiful food for 40 years, even though no one ever thanked me, even though the credit went to the family. I knew that I had created something beautiful. That was enough for me." But for every cook who found meaning in the work, there were dozens of kitchen maids and scullery maids who saw only a dead end. They worked the hardest, were paid the least, were treated the worst, and had the least hope of improvement. And yet, the kitchen was also the one place below stairs where there was a kind of meritocracy. A brilliant scullery maid could become a kitchen maid. A good kitchen maid could become an assistant cook. And an excellent cook could achieve real status, even fame. Some of the most famous chefs of the era began as servants in great houses. Mrs. Beeton, though not technically a servant herself, became famous partly for documenting the knowledge of kitchen workers. The scientific approach to cooking that emerged in the Victorian era was built on the practical knowledge of generations of cooks. In a world that offered servants almost no opportunity for advancement, the kitchen offered at least the possibility that your skills, your intelligence, and your work could matter. If the household above stairs had a strict hierarchy, it was nothing compared to the social structure that developed below stairs. The family lived as one unit, with the parents at the top and the children below them. But below stairs, there were more distinct levels, with almost no movement between them. At the very top were the upper servants, the butler, the housekeeper, the head cook, and the lady's maid or valet of the most senior family member. These servants had their own sitting room. They ate better food. They were often permitted to speak during meals. They had a degree of autonomy in their work. Below them were the middle servants, footmen, housemaids, kitchen maids, ladies' maids for less important family members. These servants ate in the servants' hall, but often seated lower at the table. They were subject to much stricter rules. They had much less freedom. At the bottom were the lower servants, the scullery maid, the hall maid, the scullery wench, the boots. These servants often ate standing up, or after everyone else had finished. They slept in the worst rooms. They had almost no rights. This hierarchy created a fascinating and tragic dynamic. The upper servants, having achieved a degree of status, were invested in maintaining it. This meant enforcing the hierarchy against the lower servants. A housekeeper who had achieved her position was not interested in making it easier for the housemaids below her. Easier for them might threaten her position. So the housekeeper became an agent of oppression against the servants she supervised. She enforced the rules strictly. She punished any breach of hierarchy. She maintained social distance. One memoir describes a lady's maid who had risen to her position through years of excellent service. Once she achieved this status, she became almost cruel to the housemaids below her. The author speculates that this was because she feared losing her position, feared that if the housemaids weren't kept strictly subordinate, they might somehow threaten her status. This created a situation where servants were set against each other, unable to form a unified group, unable to collectively resist the system. The upper servants policed the lower servants, maintaining the hierarchy on behalf of the family. And there were additional layers of hierarchy based on gender, on specialization, and on the family they served. Male servants had higher status than female servants. A footman was superior to a housemaid, even if the housemaid was older and more experienced. This created the absurd situation where a 20-year-old footman could order a 50-year-old housemaid to do something. Servants who specialized in particular skills, a lady's maid who was particularly good at hairdressing, a butler who was an expert in wine, had higher status than general servants. But this also meant that if your skills became obsolete, your position became obsolete. And servants employed in well-known great houses had higher status than those employed in lesser houses. A servant at Blenheim Palace had more prestige than a servant at a small country house. This was a carefully constructed social hierarchy that served a crucial function. It kept servants divided, competing, and focused on maintaining their own position rather than on critiquing the system itself. But servants, being human, also created their own culture and community. Despite the formal hierarchy, servants developed genuine friendships. A housemaid might be close friends with a kitchen maid, despite the formal distance between their positions. Servants shared gossip, secrets, and support. And this informal culture had its own rules and ethics. Servants kept each other's secrets. If one servant had a romantic relationship, others might help conceal it. If one servant was in trouble, others might help. There was a code of solidarity that existed below the formal hierarchy. One memoir describes this: "We were separated by rank, but united by experience. We all understood what it was like to be at the bottom of society, to have no rights, to be treated as less than fully human. So we helped each other where we could." This underground culture provided a kind of psychological refuge. It allowed servants to maintain a sense of self and humanity, despite a system designed to deny both. Servants also developed their own entertainment and social life within the constraints of their situation. On their rare evenings off, servants would gather in the servants' hall to read, to talk, to play cards or other games. Some houses had musical servants who would play instruments. Servants would learn about the world through conversations with servants from other houses, who would share news and gossip about people they knew. A servant might hear gossip about another servant being married and feel genuine happiness for them. A servant might learn that a friend had gotten a better position and feel pride in their accomplishment. These small moments of connection and celebration were crucial for maintaining mental health and human dignity. Sunday was also important because it was church day. Servants would dress in their best clothes, sit in the back of the church, in the servants section, and experience a brief moment of being part of the broader community. Church was often the one time a servant might see people outside of service, might feel part of something larger than the household. Some servants took their faith very seriously. For them, church wasn't just a social obligation, but a source of meaning and hope. Their suffering, they were told, would be rewarded in heaven. But other servants became cynical about religion, seeing it as a tool to make them accept their suffering. An anonymous servant wrote, "I listened to sermons about accepting my station, about the virtues of humble service, and I thought, if God is pleased by my suffering, then I do not want to be pleasing to God." The servants' world was thus a complex mixture of hierarchy and solidarity, of formality and hidden feeling, of oppression and resistance. And within this world, servants developed strategies for survival and even occasional moments of genuine happiness and connection. We've talked about the daily hardships of service, but there was something worse. The constant threat of disease, disability, and death. Life expectancy for servants was dramatically lower than for the families they served. The average life expectancy in Victorian England was around 45 to 50 years. But for servants, especially those in large households, it was significantly lower. Many servants died in their 30s and 40s. Some died in their 20s. The primary killers were infectious diseases: tuberculosis, pneumonia, typhoid, dysentery, and influenza. Tuberculosis was the biggest killer. In the crowded, poorly ventilated servants' quarters, the disease spread easily. A servant who contracted TB in an attic bedroom would infect everyone else sharing that space. Tuberculosis progressed slowly, and a servant might work while infected for months before becoming too ill to continue. One historical account describes the progression. A housemaid contracts TB in the winter. She keeps working because she can't afford to lose her job. By spring, she's coughing constantly and spitting blood into handkerchiefs she tries to hide. By summer, she's bedridden. The household sends her away because she's contagious. She dies in a charitable hospital in November, never going home again. Pneumonia was also common, particularly among servants who worked in damp conditions. A laundry maid, constantly exposed to wet, cold conditions, was very likely to develop pneumonia. Once pneumonia set in, without modern antibiotics, it often led to death. Typhoid was spread through contaminated water, and despite improvements in sanitation, it continued to be a threat. An infected servant could spread typhoid through a household. Outbreaks of typhoid in large houses, while not always fatal to the wealthy family, often killed multiple servants. Dysentery, cholera, and other intestinal diseases were common, particularly among servants who worked in the kitchens or who had poor access to sanitation. But even beyond these acute infectious diseases, servants suffered from chronic health conditions caused by their work. Respiratory disease was endemic among servants. A chimney sweep, a scullery maid breathing in constant steam and heat, a servant dealing with the dust from beating carpets. All of these developed chronic lung disease. By the time they were 50, if they made it that long, many had permanent damage to their lungs. Arthritis was common, caused by the physical labor and the dampness of the servants' quarters. A servant's hands would be swollen and painful with arthritis, making it difficult to continue working. Malnutrition was a constant problem. Although servants were fed, the diet was basic and often lacked essential nutrients. A servant might be fed enough calories to work, but not enough nutrients to remain healthy. Vitamin deficiencies were common, leading to dental problems, weakness, and vulnerability to disease. Pregnancy and childbirth were particularly dangerous for female servants. A female servant who became pregnant, whether through assault or consensual relationship, faced an impossible situation. She might continue working while pregnant, which was dangerous for both her and the child. Or she might leave service, in which case she would have no income and no references. If she gave birth in service or shortly after leaving, she faced the shame of being an unwed mother in a society that treated this as morally catastrophic. She would likely lose any chance of future employment in respectable service. If she tried to keep the child, she would be destitute. Most women in this situation were forced to give up their children to orphanages or workhouses, or to arrange adoptions. The emotional trauma of being forced to give up a child was severe, and many women never recovered from it. But this was presented as a normal consequence of sexual transgression, not as a tragedy. Childbirth itself was dangerous. In the early 1900s, maternal mortality in Britain was around 4 to 5 deaths per 1,000 births. For poor women without access to good medical care, the rate was higher. A pregnant servant giving birth in a hospital ward, surrounded by other poor women with minimal medical care, faced significant risk. Some survived and lived long lives. Others died from infection, hemorrhage, or complications during delivery. And then there was the issue of what happened when a servant became too ill or too old to work. A servant who was injured permanently or who developed a chronic disease that prevented work was cast out of the household. There was no workers' compensation, no insurance, no safety net. A servant who was injured while working might be given a small amount of money to go away, but this was not a legal requirement. Some employers were kind and provided something. Others simply dismissed the injured servant to fend for themselves. An elderly servant who had worked for 50 years might be pensioned off with a small amount, perhaps 5 shillings a week, equivalent to a few £100s in modern currency, which was enough to rent a tiny room in a workhouse or a slum. A workhouse was a publicly run institution where poor people who had nowhere else to go were housed and fed. In exchange, they were put to work at tedious, meaningless tasks. The conditions were deliberately harsh and degrading, based on the theory that poverty was caused by moral failing and that harsh conditions would discourage people from seeking aid. For a servant who had spent 50 years in respectful service, ending up in a workhouse was a profound humiliation. The elderly former servants who ended up there were often treated as paupers, stripped of the dignity they had maintained throughout their working lives. A memoir from a former servant, written near the end of her life, described visiting a friend in the workhouse. She had worked all her life, just as I had. But because she had no family and no pension, she ended up here. She looked at me with such shame, even though she had done nothing wrong. She had simply done what she was supposed to do. She had served faithfully for 50 years. And this was her reward. But the effects of service didn't end with death. They extended to the afterlife, at least in terms of burial. A wealthy family would be buried in the family plot, often with a grand tombstone that would mark their grave for centuries. A servant, if buried at all, would likely be in an unmarked grave in the paupers section of the graveyard, or in a mass grave where dozens of poor people were buried together. A servant who had devoted her life to maintaining and beautifying a grand house might end up in an unmarked grave that would be forgotten within a generation. No one would visit it. No one would remember her name. This fate, to work hard, to suffer, to die young or old, and then to be forgotten, was the reality for millions of servants. The system was not just exploitative. It was designed to erase. Servants were meant to be forgotten, their lives meant to be erased from history. They were to exist in service and then cease to exist. But their diaries, their letters, their memoirs, and the oral histories preserved by their descendants tell a different story. Despite the system's intention to erase them, some servants' voices have survived. And in those voices, we hear not just the tragic story of exploitation, but also the remarkable story of human resilience. For most of the Edwardian era and through the early 20th century, the system of domestic service seemed immutable. It had existed for centuries. It seemed natural, inevitable, and divinely ordained. But by the early 1900s, cracks were beginning to show in the system. The first crack came from economic reality. Young people, particularly young women, began to realize that there were other options besides service. As factories expanded and towns grew, there were more jobs available. A woman could work in a factory or shop and have more freedom, more leisure time, and sometimes similar or better pay than she would get in service. Factory work had its own problems, the conditions were harsh, the pay was often low, and it was repetitive. But it had a crucial advantage over service. You could leave. When your shift ended, you were no longer under the authority of your employer. You had your own time. The decline in domestic service began around 1900 and accelerated dramatically after the First World War. The war changed everything. During the war, many servants left their positions to work in munitions factories or in other war-related work. The pay was better. The working conditions, though harsh, were understood to be temporary and for a patriotic cause. Women felt that they were doing something important. And when the war ended, many of these women refused to return to service. The experience of working outside of the household, of having more freedom, of being paid more fairly, made it impossible to go back. A woman who had earned good money in a factory, who had experienced a degree of independence, who had proven she could do work outside of service, she often refused to return to being a servant. There was also a shift in social attitudes. During the war, people began to question the social order more fundamentally. Why should some people have so much and others have so little? Why should women be confined to certain roles? Why should a rigid class system determine someone's entire life? Servants began to organize. Trade unions for domestic workers were formed. Servants published manifestos and letters demanding better treatment, better wages, and better conditions. In 1905, a group of servants in London published an anonymous account of their experiences that became famous. It was called The Servant Problem, from the perspective of the servants, not the employers, and it detailed the exploitation, the long hours, the lack of privacy, and the abuse that servants endured. The publication scandalized polite society. How dare servants speak out? How dare they air grievances publicly? But once the conversation had started, it couldn't be stopped. Some servants left service and started new lives. They became shop workers, factory workers, nurses, teachers, and secretaries. Some became writers and journalists, using their experiences to critique the system. Rose Dutton, the lady's maid who had been assaulted, became a journalist and wrote extensively about the exploitation of servants. Her columns and articles exposed the worst abuses of the system. Margaret Powell, the cook we mentioned earlier, became a radio personality and author, telling the real story of service to a national audience. Constance Smith, another former servant, wrote a memoir titled The Diaries of an English Kitchen Maid. that became a bestseller and changed how people understood domestic service. These women's words had power because they were first-hand testimony. They were written by people who had actually lived through the system, not by sympathetic observers or reformers. They couldn't be dismissed as exaggeration or fiction. And their words resonated, particularly with younger people who were beginning to question the social order. The decline in domestic service was thus both economic and ideological. Young people were attracted away from service by better economic opportunities, but they were also repelled by growing awareness of how exploitative the system was. By 1920, domestic service was beginning to decline significantly. By 1930, it had become difficult to find servants. By 1945, the system had largely collapsed. The Second World War finished what the First World War had started. Again, women left service to do war work. Again, they experienced greater freedom and better pay. And again, when the war ended, they refused to return. By 1950, domestic service had become a rarity rather than a norm. The era of the grand household with dozens of servants had ended. Some of the great houses continued, but with far fewer staff. Some were converted into institutional uses: schools, hospitals, hotels. Some fell into decline and were eventually demolished. The world that had seemed so permanent, so inevitable, had changed fundamentally in just 40 years. But what happened to all those servants? Some found better lives. They worked in shops, offices, hospitals, and schools. Many were able to educate their children and move into the middle class. Some became quite successful. But others struggled. The psychological damage of having been treated as less than human left marks that didn't fade easily. Some servants, even after leaving service, couldn't quite believe they had the right to refuse, to demand, to assert themselves. An oral history from the 1970s features an elderly woman who had been a servant in her youth. She was describing her current life. She owned her home, she was comfortably retired, she had had a successful career after leaving service. And yet when describing a situation where she had to assert her rights, she said, "I felt like I was being rude, like I was overstepping. That feeling never quite goes away." The damage was real and lasting. But so was the victory. The system of domestic service, which had seemed immutable, which had seemed divinely ordained, which had been maintained through psychological manipulation and economic coercion, had been broken. And it was broken not by benevolent employers who decided to treat their servants better. It was broken by servants themselves, by their refusal to accept the system, by their willingness to leave, by their courage in speaking out and telling the truth. The last generation of traditional domestic servants lived long lives, and many of them used those years to tell their stories. They wrote memoirs, they gave interviews, they shared their experiences with younger generations. In doing so, they ensured that the real story of domestic service wouldn't be forgotten. They made sure that future generations would understand what had actually happened in those grand houses, beyond the romanticized versions that would later be portrayed on film and television. We've spent these hours together exploring the real Downton Abbey, not the story Hollywood told, but the story told by servants themselves. We've walked through the hierarchy that governed every moment of their lives. We've seen their struggles and their courage. We've witnessed their love and their longing, despite everything that tried to deny it. We've seen the dangers they faced, and we've seen how they endured. But most importantly, we've seen their humanity. What moves me most about their stories is how often, even while describing the most difficult conditions, they assert their personhood. They loved. They dreamed. They found moments of joy. They kept their humanity intact, despite a system that tried to erase it. One former servant wrote, "In my heart, I knew that I was as valuable as they were. And I survived by holding on to that knowledge." That knowledge, that inner truth about their own worth, is what carried them through. The servants of the past couldn't have imagined the world we live in today. Many of their struggles have been overcome. Many of the systems that oppress them have crumbled. And yet, the memory of their lives remains, not as a burden, but as a testament to human resilience. As you drift off to sleep tonight, I want you to know that you've honored their memory by listening to their story. By hearing their voices, you've helped ensure that they aren't forgotten. That matters. The world has changed because people demanded it. And while there's still work to be done, that gives us hope. As you let your eyes close, as your breathing slows, as you drift towards sleep, know that you've given yourself a gift tonight. You've rested. You've listened. You've let stories and history wash over you without the pressure to do anything but exist. That's enough. You've done enough. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to the story of these remarkable people. Thank you for letting their voices be heard. Sleep well tonight, knowing that you're safe, you're warm, and you're exactly where you need to be. May your rest be peaceful and restorative. May you wake refreshed, carrying with you the resilience and courage of those whose stories you've heard. I'll be here whenever you want to listen again, but for now, let yourself drift. Good night.